Hi. Um, Thank you for joining us this afternoon. For those of you who were here for our earlier panel, you got to hear a discussion about vision for accelerating the pace of innovation in cities. This is a three-part panel series. We're on part number 2, discussing workflow. So after all of the big vision talk that we've heard this morning, I have invited a few guests that can help us get down to the brass tacks of what it's like to work with cities when they have these visions and what the implementation challenges can be, but also many of the different opportunities that can be enabled working in collaborative settings with government partners and specifically around technology. I'm Catherine Nikolovsky. I'm the founder and executive director of Hack Oregon, which has a special announcement if you're on the demo yesterday, just become the Civic Software Foundation, and we're shifting our focus to support our platform nationally. And so I'm moderating these panels because we wanted to talk with a whole network of people that can support the values around collaboration when it comes to building these technology systems. And we know it's tough work, and I'm so happy to introduce our panelists. In fact, well, we have the Sunlight Foundation with us, and Katya, and Sheila Martin is the director of Portland State Institute of Metropolitan Studies, and Craig Worrell, who is the really interesting title, Gigabit Portfolio Manager at Mozilla. And so the first question that I have with all of, I think for each person is, when you describe a little bit about what your experience is day to day working with governments, and when they have an idea to try to implement and these different systems, and what kinds of experiences tend to come up?
I can start. Yeah, hi, I'm Katya Abazajian with the Open Cities team at the Sunlight Foundation, just to recap. Our work, so just to give a little bit of background on what we do and kind of where my experience is coming from, we're a partner on the What Works Cities initiative, which means we've worked with over 60 cities around the country to develop open data policies and generally to help them launch open data programs in a way that's transparent and accessible to members of the community. And then we also help cities go beyond that and facilitate the use of open data in the community so that people can actually use the information to solve problems. So one thing I guess I would say that I see often in cities is that I think it's kind of dangerous to think of open data as an IT software rollout, and you would be surprised how often that is the expectation. So that when we're adopting open data, what we're doing is actually buying a platform, restructuring our IT workflows, setting up data governance. Yes, all that stuff happens, but I think the thing that catches cities off guard the most is the amount of cultural change that needs to happen in order to change into kind of a transparency mindset. So adopting open data obviously is not just about launching a portal and publishing data sets, but rather about going beyond that and using transparency and openness in a variety of areas of your work. So I think just to make that concrete, I think that one way that we see cities grow into that mindset is where, rather than just thinking that they owe data to the IT team to post to the portal, they start sharing data or having open conversations with residents in their day-to-day work. So I know that many city staff on the front lines already have lots of conversations with residents. And I think folks that really get the purpose of open data are ones who, in their day-to-day conversations providing services to residents, they're able to say, oh, we have this data set that I can make sure it gets uploaded to the portal for you, and let me tell you how to use it, and if you need help understanding it, just let me know. So it's kind of like taking that extra step to really be culturally open.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sheila Martin. I'm director of the Institute of Portland Metropolitan Studies at Portland State University and the Population Research Center. So we consider ourselves a data intermediary organization. So we are actually tasked with helping community members use data through our State Data Center project. And also we view ourselves as a portal to the university resources for community members. And so one of the things that we are focused on is helping community organizations use information in order to make the case that they're trying to make to the city or the county or whoever it might be to make positive changes for people in their community. And we do that in a variety of different ways. Sometimes it's just by answering questions about data. Sometimes it's by doing GIS trainings for community organizations. But one of the things that we do for cities is we help them think through how, what is important to track. In other words, is there a set of objectives that we have for our city or our region that we need to be able to track in order to be accountable to our community? So let's think through what data is required in order to do that, in order to be accountable, in order to hold ourselves accountable for those objectives. And so we've stood up a couple of data platforms that help with that. One is Greater Portland Pulse, which is a community indicators project that was developed over the course of 2 years, where we gathered community members and asked them, what are our objectives for our region, and how are we going to know whether we're moving in the right direction? And then we facilitate conversations around those results and report those results to the community and encourage discussion about whether or not we are doing the right things in order to move in that direction. So I have more to say about how we ensure in the age of open data that we are collecting the right things and making sure the information gets into the right hands, but I'll pass the microphone on for now.
Wonderful, thank you. My name is Craig Worrell. I work for Mozilla, so the makers of Firefox web browser, but also have a secondary role at an organization called US Ignite. I'm the community lead for them. They are a federal public-private partnership, a nonprofit that helps transform smart cities by using high-speed infrastructure. That's also kind of what I do with the Gigabit Community Fund at Mozilla, is investing in communities across the United States, utilizing their high-speed broadband for public benefit. Mozilla is 5 cities across the United States. It's Eugene, Oregon, where I operate, Austin, Texas, Kansas City, Lafayette, Louisiana, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. And the US Ignite program is 25 communities across the world, 24 are domestic, and then there's one in Adelaide, Australia, who hopefully we're going to be partnering with pretty soon on a high-speed telescope program with youth. So pretty cool stuff that we're doing. And previously I've worked federally, and I'm really interested in the dynamics of how this open data platform is different at the federal level to, rural Oregon. It's a completely different game. At the federal level, we're talking about how does this data influence, criminal justice reform? How can we get people out of the system, move them out? On the local level in rural, Coos Bay, Oregon, we're not worrying about that. We're trying to figure out where are the fire hydrants. We've lost track of them. And it's just funny navigating the difference in scale and depth. And there is a lot of skepticism around, I think, open data, new tech in local governments, and I think there should be, because a lot of times it's people's livelihoods. They've had this career in local government for 30 years. Tech changes so quickly. Do they always keep up? No. Are there new people vying for jobs? Yes. And it's just funny to kind of see that happening. And my job is basically just to be this facilitator who kind of glues everyone together, gets funding in the right places, tries to get people working together and realizing, let's not be skeptics, but let's realize the reality of what data means in government and in nonprofits and in corporate America and beyond. So thanks for having me.
Katya, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the Sunlight Foundation, which is a nonprofit that can come in to support not only funding channels to make some opportunities for policy to pave the way for these open data commitments from cities, and then there's the implementation.
Right.
And I know that through the What Works Cities Challenge, it has been very successful in getting this policy passed. And then the next question is, what are we going to do with this now that we have more open data? And so getting into how this transition from a successful policy to actually a real thing that's sustainable, how do you see the next phase of this work?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I guess I should clarify first that under the What Works Cities initiative, it's a funded initiative in which we offer free technical assistance to cities that apply for membership to the partnership. So Portland has received free technical assistance on developing the policy and on doing implementation of the open data program. So yeah, I think the way that you laid it out was fairly accurate. We come in initially to establish a policy to help build internal buy-in around the idea of open data and start having conversations to, like I said, establish that cultural expectation that transparency is an important piece of doing your work as a public servant. The next piece that's contained under What Works Cities is the implementation of governance structures. And so what we try to do is, we have a partner at the Center for Government Excellence at Johns Hopkins University, and they specialize in setting up the internal governance structures that will support the implementation of the policy measures that the city has decided on. So what we try to do is build internal capacity so that departments start talking to each other. They have set meeting structures for how to release data to the public. They have set ways to evaluate and incorporate public feedback on what should and shouldn't be private or public. And so that it all comes as a part of rolling out the open data policy. But which you alluded to, there is another step beyond that, which is facilitating the use of that data. So I think what that requires is coming back to the initial idea of why people want to do open data in the first place. The city wants to provide open data because citizens deserve access to information that's collected about them by the government, by using their taxpayer money. Then the city wants to see those people digest that information. The city wants to see those people use that information to achieve their goals or to advocate for the change they want to see or to help participate in decision making. And so where we are now is we're trying to build on that foundation of policy and practice and really encourage cities to get out of their comfort zone a little bit and start looking for innovative ways to partner with members of the community and start really listening to community needs. So not only providing data and information, but seeing it as a two-way street where residents can use data to tell you something in a way that is founded in information. So what we've heard, I think, from residents in cities that we've worked in, and I think it really speaks to the impact of this work, is that residents who have participated in the open data programs that we've helped work on have said, I care about X issue in my community, and I regularly go to city council to speak on that, but when I go, I want to be prepared, I want to be informed, and I want to make sure that what I'm recommending is actually the right thing to do. And so I think that really speaks to what citizens want. And I think that it also has a lot of positive implications for how cities do business and how they make decisions with the informed opinions of the public.
Thank you. And Sheila, the Institute of Metropolitan Studies has been creating and maintaining data resources that are very important for the city of Portland that are not only used by various groups, but is a real source of information that the city relies on. And so how do you achieve being able to implement this work in a way that is effective, but I imagine working with government and working with various partners, but a lot of this includes some other many considerations.
Everyone who works in my office is passionate about public service. You wouldn't be working at a university if you weren't, well, at least not in my office. You wouldn't be working in my office if you weren't passionate about that. It's actually not something you can teach someone, it's something that someone comes to the table with. And so we look for that. And so, we collaborate with the city. I think that we try to be sensitive to the fact that it's difficult to be a risk taker when you work for a local government that's being scrutinized very carefully. And so we try to help the cities and counties understand that through this transparency, they can improve their ability to communicate the potential risks and rewards of some of the things that they're doing. So it's really hard to experiment, I think, when you're under an intense spotlight. But I think this is what those of us that are sitting here are trying to help local governments to do, to innovate, be honest and careful about the risks and rewards of those innovations. So, for example, one of the things that we've done lately is we've put together a housing data hub where we're putting together best practices and providing examples of things that other communities have done in order to try to promote affordable housing, and that is obviously of intense interest to communities in the Portland region because of what's happened to our housing prices. So, by providing them some transparent information about what's been tried and what's worked in other places, we're giving them some of the tools in order to hold a conversation with community members about how we should be moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Do you have ideas for what benchmarks for success might look like when this is such a continuous effort and at its core an act of public service to be creating things that get information to people around public issues? There's no clear line for like when we've done it, and so when we are operating with bureaus that need to have these performance metrics to understand, to continue creating real programs that are in partnership with groups like Sunlight Foundation or Institute of Metropolitan Studies, how do we create a framework to validate successful programs?
Well, one of the things that we developed some metrics for our own success at one point. They're very difficult to measure, and that is sort of the quality of the dialogue around public policy issues is really important. And in our region, we have people who are really well informed about public policy issues, but elevating the quality of that debate, I think, can always be an important goal. And the fact that people are using information, they're bringing that information to the table when they are commenting on public policy issues in front of an elected body, and providing their position, but from a position of knowledge. I think that's an important benchmark.
Yeah. Craig, it's a similar question because I know that one of Mozilla's focus areas is creating an open and healthy internet. Mm-hmm. And so how does Mozilla measure success on that? And in particular, if we're looking at measuring open and healthy internet, meaning getting some open data, getting some information into people's hands through the web, what would you look for? What's exciting to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, our whole organization is founded on openness. I mean, we came from, it was just a scrappy group of people, they pulled Netscape Navigator out of the death grips and said, let's turn this into an open source web browser. Let's have people create the web. And that's how we got started, and it's ingrained in our DNA. And I get to be picky because I'm a grant maker, I'm a philanthropist, and I give away Mozilla's money. And if you're not willing to be open and share your data and share your best practices and everything you learn with the community, you're not getting our money. And that is, a way that we can work as a nonprofit in capitalism, a very successful nonprofit with a lot of money, to kind of help form open data practices and keep that going. And when we go into communities and work with local governments, tell them to open up their data, there's funding available. People respond really well to that incentive. Dangle the money in front of them and say, make this open and work with other communities and you'll get this money. And that works for us. Obviously they can't work for everyone, but the more larger tech organizations, like the Alphabets and Googles and Amazons that start incentivizing that as part of their philanthropy and making philanthropy more of a part of their practices, the better it's going to get. And groups like formerly Hack Oregon, or Foundation, what is your name?
We're the Civic Software Foundation.
Civic Software
As
Foundation.
of today.
Yeah, groups like that make it much better. We just need to make that, an active thing in communities. I work with a group in Austin called Open Austin, who's doing very similar work, and creating this network nationwide of people who are incentivizing open data practices is what it's going to take. So this is a good start.
Yeah. And when you were talking, I just immediately am looking over to Katya thinking, well, if a city manages to get some of Mozilla's money, if they commit and do all of the right things around openness, and they might be holding the check and looking around saying, okay, well now how do we actually do the thing? And I feel like this is a situation that you were finding yourself in constantly. What happens when a city actually pulls together resources, or that you've already made investments to get policies passed? We're talking about going from ideas to something that actually, and let's be specific here and say, we're trying to get data on the web in a way that's accessible. What is this process like where we can actually come in to help government even use this funding effectively and make sure that we can deliver? Because there have been a number of, well, the track record isn't great for government delivering software.
Right. Yeah. I feel like you really teed me up for this one. But so one thing that we're piloting right now is user-centered design for open data. And so we've completed 3 pilots. We're actually piloting 2 more projects with Austin and with Norfolk, Virginia, basically to do exactly that. So these cities have demonstrated interest. They have open data. They have a policy. They have teams dedicated to making data more accessible online and in person. And we are there to make sure that their projects are grounded in actual community needs. And so this is where kind of our expertise around public discourse and being a longstanding organization focused on transparency and accountability comes in, because we've worked extensively at the federal level on how governments should establish channels for feedback, what the best practices are for disclosure, how to facilitate conversations in the open, kind of these types of mechanisms that are kind of infrastructural and providing transparency. And the pilots that we're working on now are, how do you leverage those mechanisms to support a person or a type of person who has a really clear need for data in their life? And so, for example, the project that we've completed in Madison was doing a survey of all the, so essentially we chose a focus area that mattered to the community. So that's where we started. We said, the city wants to work on open data, they want to make it more accessible, what issue do people care about? And we started with neighborhood well-being, so data that's contained to small areas, neighborhood well-being in general. We found that there were really clear needs for data use among nonprofit staff. So that was a user persona that we found through our user research. And we built out kind of all the various areas of like what those types of users need. So they have low data capacity generally, they're social service providers, they're not data experts, they're not coders. So how do you provide, the question was, how do you provide data to them in a way that will help them achieve their goals without asking them to download a raw CSV file, or without asking them to learn R in order to just be able to use the information that the city wants to provide. And eventually what we did was we found that the goal that they wanted to achieve was to acquire more funding, which I'm sure every nonprofit ever has that goal, but particularly small neighborhood nonprofits. And in order to help them achieve that goal, the city decided to build data toolkits that would help neighborhood nonprofits in one specific neighborhood apply for funding. And so they created a data toolkit to meet this user persona's need that is like a set of really easily understandable data sources. We digested everything. We made it really clear to read. We said, all you need to do is pull these statistics and put them in your application for funding, and this will make your application more data informed. And so that's the type, and that was a Google Doc that we sent out, and folks in the community commented on it and said, this doesn't make sense. And city staff responded to the comment on Google Docs and said, I can send you the data source for this if you're interested. Like, that is the kind of discourse that we want to see, and that's a fairly low-tech online solution that allowed a new data user to access open data. So that's the approach that we're taking, a really focused, kind of user-centered approach to helping cities facilitate data use.
I have a question for Sheila in that, okay, so we actually get to a place where we're building things, right, and funded, and we're starting to achieve outcomes. You are all conducting research, right, that oftentimes is bringing to light new information, and this is an independent, backed up with the data that people can now see. What's your relationship to the disruption to workflow when cities actually respond to the information that they're seeing? When you start working with data, you don't always know what you're going to get. And so when we're looking at things around housing, sometimes it can be a challenge to have an honest conversation, especially when that information is public and we want discourse to inform this policy. And I feel, tell me more about your role and experience being in that position.
Well, I think that our role is first and foremost to be a neutral source of information. And so although we're not afraid to call things as we see them, we're not advocating for specific responses to conditions. We provide other people the information that they need in order to do the advocacy that they need to do. And I'll give you an example I'm kind of proud of. That is, we were very, a while ago, I think it was 2004, Measure 37 passed in Oregon. And for those of you who don't know what Measure 37 was, it was a citizens initiative that was under the category of takings initiatives. And so basically it said if any government passes a law or regulation that limits what I can do with my property and that has a financial impact on me, then they either need to pay me or they need to rescind the regulation. So it had huge implications for lots of areas of life in Oregon, and most importantly in our land use laws, but also things like billboards and whether or not you can put a strip mine in the middle of a beautiful place, or just all kinds of things that that people were beginning to worry about. So one of the things that we did was we built a database of every single Measure 37 claim in the state of Oregon. And this was not an insignificant undertaking because, every city had different claims, every county had different claims, the regional government had different claims, and the state had different claims. And some of them were keeping track of them, but no one was keeping track of all of them so that we had a sense of what it all added up to. And so we had to do things like drive out to remote counties in Oregon and make copies of paper claims that were being made because there weren't enough staff in those counties to send us, to even make copies and send us the data. So we did that, and I know this is a long-winded way of me saying the resulting database was used the following year. There was a counter initiative to pull back on the original initiative. And so we had this database, it was available online, we were giving presentations about what it was showing, about the potential impact of this initiative, and both sides of the debate used our data. So we were particularly proud of that because we felt like that meant that we had been trusted as a neutral source of information, that it wasn't just the pro Initiative 49, I think that was the number, or the anti-Initiative 49 people that were using it. They were all using it. They were using it in different ways, but they were both using it. And so I felt like that was a win for us because we were seen as a source of information that could be used regardless of what your particular agenda was. And I think that's a unique role for universities because we don't advocate, as organizations, we don't advocate for particular things.
Craig, Mozilla has a reputation for driving sort of a lot of thought leadership around open source. I think oftentimes when I talk about open source and people don't know what I'm talking about, I'd say, well, you use Mozilla, right? And Firefox, you know about that. That's open source. And so, how do you think when we're talking about open data, and again, like on the web, you are in a unique position to create a call to action for cities to want to do something interesting. And so how do you see that relationship between creating that call to action? What do cities seem to want to do when they're given opportunity?
That's interesting. Well, one thing we're trying to do is really empower local leaders, and we're really ramping up our, we have grant makers like me around the world for Mozilla, but we also have new fellowship programs, and when we've had fellowship programs, we're really expanding them and blowing them up and trying to make sure, someone can answer to every region and kind of guide or create local experts. And we have open leadership trainings, which is something, going into communities, going into different groups, and teaching them what does it mean to work in the open, and we have resources available online if you're interested. We also now have an annual conference in London every year, which I know is quite a trek, but it's called MozFest, and it's, you know, just a weekend of bringing people together all around the world and kind of co-locating them and teaching them, like, what does open leadership look like? And let's go back to where we're from and develop this sense of, you know, openness in the community, including, you know, local governments, state governments, and people from the federal government all around the world are showing up to these events. And that's all we're trying to do, because, you know, this idea of creating things in the open, if you do it from the get-go, it just becomes a mentality, it just becomes the standard. Trying to go into, you know, a place of work or a local government that's had this bureaucratic, closed mindset for years, that's really hard not to crack. But once we get in and keep it open, it just kind of keeps that mentality going. So if any of you are interested to apply to be a Mozilla Fellow in education policy, design, any of it, we welcome you at any moment. And then I just wanted to add an anecdote to the last few comments. But in my community, in my county, our local quantitative dude, the stat guy for the state, shares an office with our economic development director for our local chamber. And that's like a totally old school, like not smart city, but you know, it is smart city, like breaking down those silos in an analog way, getting people working together in the same room. I think that's huge, just getting these different community development, economic development orgs from different tiers of government, different sectors working together. I've seen it, you know, locally, just that opens up the data because people are turning around and sharing their data, which just creates such a community benefit and really, you know, accelerates impact.
Thank you. And we got started a little bit late, so we're running a little bit late, but I think that I want to come back to, and for those of you who are in the panel this morning, you've noticed that there are some really strong themes around collaboration being like an imperative, and actually it's necessary to be firing on all cylinders when it comes to breaking down barriers between departments and then working with third parties and with our technology industry and citizens who live in these cities. That is like 90% of the work, is creating collaborative frameworks for these opportunities then to arise, where you can have funding and have time to actually build a technology that reflects our values. And I see all of you on this panel as facilitators of enabling these types of collaboration when government is constrained by their own bureaucratic systems. And so I would love to hear from each of you about where you see the opportunity for collaboration, and with the work that you're committed to, how this is your greatest hope for impact when it works. Maybe let's start with Katya.
Okay. Yeah, I think the first thing, two things immediately come to mind. The first is that I think that, like Sheila mentioned earlier, it's really easy to say that cities should be innovating and experimenting and starting all these new collaborations, but at the end of the day, it's really difficult to do, especially because what we see in What Works Cities is that department staff who are working on day-to-day subject matter issues are way more empowered to follow up on leads or start new partnerships when their leadership expresses that that's a priority. And so that's something that I think we shouldn't overlook, that mayoral support and executive support for transparency and for collaboration are really important in creating a culture around that. And then I think second, I guess what I want to see is that I want to see city staff like really use the connections that they already have at their disposal. I think that that's one thing that has surprised me since I've been working in this area, is that a lot of city staff work directly with other nonprofit organizations, other departments, or members of the community. They attend public meetings, they go to community meetings. But for some reason, there's a disconnect in that they don't feel empowered to follow up on that connection and make something real, or to support the community in a way where they can put actual time in their day-to-day towards facilitating or kind of bolstering that relationship. And so I guess what I want to see is that people think small, like don't be overwhelmed by the idea of collaboration, but really just focus on the relationships that you do have and try and look for new ways to talk to the people that you already do know. I think that that's one way that we do see a lot of impact, is just when members of the community have relationships with someone in a department and that helps them get something done. There's a way to build on that rather than thinking that collaboration needs to be at the entire department level or at the entire city level.
I'd like to build on that because we're in the process right now. We've just rolled out an open data platform called NODE, the Northwest Open Data Exchange. And this started as simply an attempt for us to organize our own data and metadata within our department internally because I was somewhat frustrated by things like finding that two different people were working on the same data set at the same time and didn't realize that they were. And you wouldn't think that would happen in a small organization, but sometimes it does. And so we started with that, but then we realized as we executed the OpenGov platform that this was going to enable us to invite collaboration with other departments in the university and with community organizations and with city organizations, and that not only that could really encourage collaboration because we could understand that we were working with similar kinds of data or with different kinds of data towards similar ends. And so, you know, this is really sort of a new way of, I think, of encouraging conversations about, you know, what people are doing and toward what end and how they might collaborate. And we saw a big need for this internally within the university, and then it has these external benefits that we did not necessarily expect, but are really happy are happening.
Yeah, I talked a little bit before about skepticism, and I deal with a lot of that. But I have a very human-centered focus to all this work, and we're so lucky to have Technology Association of Oregon, where I work. They're a major partner of mine, and it's about, you know, educating local leaders, people that are influential in government, expressing the importance of open data. Because a lot of times, if it's not, you know, stemming from fear, it's just stemming from, you know, ignorance, and it's about educating what are the benefits of having this. And you know, a smart city is only as smart as its residents, as its people. So if the people don't want something, it's not going to happen. But getting the people that do know the benefits of open data and what this can mean for the future of the city in the room, whether that's a city council meeting or, you know, privately held meetings, and making them active in the community, making them engaged, and public participation trumps everything. I can't use that word, I'm sorry. Public participation is better than any other system when it comes to changing local governments and state governments and beyond. So that's my passion, that's my love.
Thank you. What I'd like it if we could maybe put into more concrete terms, if you had 3 bullet points that you could say on, like, these are the challenges that we face when we're trying to implement work, or perhaps things that maybe prevent work from even starting in the first place. Like, where is your space that you feel like all of these different experiences and conversations and like anecdotes, where are you still challenged to lean into you know, more tactical solutions, if that makes sense, and just maybe not a long answer, but like, what are the 3 things that you could use 3 words?
Yeah. I will try to keep this as short as possible, but I think the first one is data sharing agreements. Just the difficulty of like getting those through, like figuring out who can share what and establishing. It's such a like nerdy answer, but really just need better like ways to share data. The second one would be something about the, I guess, cities' organizational structures that don't account for the need for communications, like public communications, flyers, like social media kind of campaigns, things like that. and community engagement teams. So like cities that don't have community engagement teams are really kind of at a loss when it comes to sharing open data. And then finally, I would say like a kind of a cop-out, but like a true community-centered mentality, willingness to accept what residents do propose, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's also still a mentality of proprietariness among many of my colleagues. As I've been rolling out this open data platform, I've learned that there are certain faculty that don't want to share their data because this is their competitive advantage in publishing new papers. And so that's not a very collaborative attitude, and I certainly understand the place where that's coming from. But maybe understanding a little bit more about how we might be able to adjust incentives in order to encourage that collaboration instead of that, that proprietary nature. And obviously that's not just among university faculty. There are government-funded organizations that are also very guarded about how they're going to share their data because they're afraid of what that might say about them, and possibly for good reasons, or maybe not. Maybe they, accountability is a hard thing, and I think that it's a challenge to encourage people that in the long run it's going to be better for their organization if they're accountable.
Yeah, so funding is the one I can help out with, so that is a major hindrance and something I'm able to help a little bit with. Second one is kind of a backlog of data, and I think that influences future open data. Like, we have all this data, how are we gonna open this up? I actually was talking, a lot of my friends are planners, and they were sitting around a table looking at this old zoning code from 30 years ago. And they were like, who wrote this? This doesn't make any sense. Like, it's totally like illogical. It contradicts itself. And then the person that was saying this was like, oh, I wrote this 30 years ago. Never mind. And I feel like that's common practice, is trying to open up and make sense of analog data we've had and how that influences our mindset for the future. I had one other bullet point. I don't remember what it was, so I can pass it. Oh, one more.
I just want to mention one more thing, and it goes along with Katya's comments about design thinking and applying that to open data, and that is, we really, before we start designing data collection plans for smart cities and other purposes, I think we need to be thinking about how decision makers are going to use it. What are they, decision makers and citizens, what are they going to be, how are they going to be presented with the data in a way that will allow them to understand which way, where does the weight of the evidence fall? So I think we need to be doing experimentation with different ways of visualizing data and understanding the benefits and costs of different data collection formats. Because, collecting data is not free. It has cost as well as risk, and we need to balance that against how much benefit we will get from presenting that data to decision makers. And so I think there's a lack of experimentation around how we are presenting data in a way that will actually help someone with their decision-making process.
Yeah, I'll second that. And then also second your proprietary comment, because a lot of my biggest difficulty is working with for-profits trying to work with the government, because oftentimes the for-profits are like, well, I think we have a different idea how to do this. We can probably do it better. And this is, like Sidewalk Labs and Alphabet and Google in Toronto saying like, oh, we're going to build our new Toronto and we're going to do it better than the city. They are working with the city and there is progress there, but it's this whole dynamic of, the future of government. Is it going to be in the hands of the corporations or not? And it's trying to get those parties to work together as best as possible now, so we don't have to, that could become a whole new problem in the future. But if we do it there right now and open up data together, we're all going to be better for it.
Just to reiterate some of the points that are coming together through the conversation today, certainly government has challenges when it comes to doing R&D. Funding is different than it is in the private sector for this. In some ways, if we can align groups like Mozilla that can help with some of the funding piece, and that we have really strong, committed research institutions that want to be neutral and provide information in a way that is accessible and clear and actionable for whatever the current environment is to need to make a decision. And then in terms of the policy outcomes and all of the nitty gritty of the way that cities communicate that out, with partners like the Sunlight Foundation doing this work as a nonprofit, research institutions, it's companies that have a mission and do philanthropy. It seems like everything together is what's required to even try. And ultimately, our biggest asset here is this: yes, we do have amazing technology at our fingertips, but it's still solving this human challenge that is taking a lot of its own form of experimentation and continued diligent work. And I would absolutely like to second the bullet point on cities that feel the incentive to want to engage in that process. And that is maybe the biggest workflow challenge of everything, is just approaching it with the intent of wanting to get results that serve the purpose of equity and transparency and a bottom line of just equal opportunity and creating a better city. So it means you have to be open to outcomes that you didn't expect, and you have to work with partners. And so with that, maybe some closing remarks, and I thank you all for coming here today. Both following up this panel, maybe you can tee it up for our technical panel.
Right.
Saying like, it's easy for us to be up here and saying like, oh yeah, the hardest part about it is like not the tech. The technology's here, it works, but we need to just organize ourselves better. So maybe in closing remarks, we can capture what's important and what you'd like to leave everyone with, but also we are going to talk a little bit about the technical challenges of really implementing this stuff.
Yeah, I guess as a closing, I would just say that I think that you summarized it perfectly, and I do think that, like you said, the intent of serving the community and of providing democratic access to information is what we're all really working towards here. Like, we all want individuals in the community to feel like they have a say in government, to feel like they're represented, and I see open data and transparency as a really essential part of that. So empowering people to participate in our system of government is the central reason why we're here. So that, just to keep everyone, I guess, like towards the North Star. But also, yeah, like I think the open source community and folks who are working towards really making data accessible and working out the nitty gritty of how to really create this vision of a society with free-flowing information and free-flowing access to information and services is something that I really respect the technical folks out there for working towards as part of this vision.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we have to fight against is the idea that technology has really created winners and losers in our society. And, you know, I think that we need to be continuously thinking about how to use technology as an instrument for economic mobility, because that's one of the key issues facing our society today, is that economic mobility is not a reality for many people now. How can we harness technology to turn that around? Because technology has a bad rap out there. It's destroying jobs. I mean, this is how many people see technology as a destroyer of jobs, and that people who develop technology as people who are enabling economic segregation. So I think we need to fight against that by continuously keeping our eye on the ball in terms of using technology and data to promote economic equity and economic mobility.
Yeah, I think they said it best. Technology can be daunting, so a lot of people opt out, and then, you know, that leads to economic inequalities, and, you know, not using tech as a force for good, which it can be. So what we're all trying to do is just get more people civically engaged especially through tech, people who don't have a background in tech, and it's going to take time. And there are different scales, like I said before. Los Angeles and small rural towns are not going to be on the same level at the same time. We need to acknowledge that and find out how to bridge those gaps and resource share and create local leaders who are willing to go into those areas and help kind of bridge that gap. So if you have any questions about Mozilla or US Ignite, feel free to come talk to me about that.
Thank you. Thanks all for coming. I think we are going to just jump right into our tactics panel.
My daughter's let me know. I would say she's going to the yoga, but she's decided not to.
Good for her.
She's like, we're just gonna.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe we're chatting.
So what she gonna do with her life?
She's working in the bookstore. She's in she's kind of
Is Leah here?
kid.
I want that job.
Leah, okay.
Take that. That's it. I know, right? Say 3 minutes? No? I've been drinking coffee and water all morning. According to Lyft, until 2:20. 2:20? Yeah. I don't even know when or where, like, I was, it ended up, but, yeah. That's how I know. I thought it was like, how late was I? Lyft ride received.
That's so good. Do you have a Google Timeline?
Yeah,
Check that out.
right.
You'll
It's
know
always
where
like,
you
yeah, I always do that. I did do that once, so I ended up at someone's house, I was staying there. I was like, I don't know the address. I use Google Timeline. AI developer community manager. Yeah, these are incorrectly. Carl.
Does it start at noon? I thought it ended.
No, it ends.
Okay. Like, are we going to be on track for that
That's, yeah.
ending? Well, you can walk out that door at any point.
If I do apologies,
That's
it's
okay.
a time thing.
Well, we'll try to let's try to do this because we're a pretty small group in here. I mean, we can just cut right to the chase. And this is going to be a nerdy, technical panel, depending on your tolerance for that. So let us know if you need more or less of it. I am Catherine Nikolovsky. I'm the founder and executive director. I think, does everybody know? Let me just go ahead and introduce the panel. I feel like I'm on like a time loop introducing myself to the same people as if there's a change. So happy to have Carl Fieser here today, community manager for the Intel AI Labs. And we have Leah Daniels. She's the VP of strategy at Gawa. And Michael Lang, our CTO of the Civic Platform. And the theme of today, we started off with a vision panel where we heard from leaders in government who are doing work to try to think about what smart cities would look like in 20 or 30 years and what our greatest hope could be. And we're seeing a very strong theme around, collaboration, the convening topic for our panel series today. In addition to accelerating the pace of innovation in cities, we wanted to take a lens on specifically the collaborative strategies that enable this. And this is how we get to the technology that reflects our values. And with, throughout these discussions, I was even surprised at how strong and real and authentic that seemed to be necessary, and how much at every level, from the vision to the workflow, we are challenged. And so one thing that also comes up is security and these challenges with when you start to collaborate and combine data, it brings up all different kinds of things. And this is also the theme of the entire Global Tech Jam conference, is thinking about not only smart cities, but taking a very hard look at where our values are in trust for security. So our panelists here today are all advocates for interoperability, and I want to talk a little bit more about what it means when you're collaborating between data systems. And so let's maybe start off with Michael. And would you describe the Civic platform in the way that we had a live demo last night? Who was there? Cool. So we got some people know. Yeah, could you give us a more technical view on like how you define the Civic platform?
I can try. So ultimately what we've got is we have a platform in the cloud that has a bunch of data, and then sort of ways to access that data. There's sort of like a tiered approach you can think about it. So it comes in as just plain data. You can think of that as files on a hard drive. So we store that just to make sure we have everything as we received it. And then you sort of massage that into a database. So you can actually query it and do analysis on top of that. And then a level beyond that is creating APIs. So then anybody can interact with these APIs rather than needing database access to do analysis. And then the final layer is this presentation view. So you don't have to be a developer to look at our data and get insights. And that includes not only just like static graphs, but last night we introduced the sandbox, which allows for even more collaborative analysis for any individual who can operate a dropdown on a web page.
Great. And Leah, would you describe a little bit more of your role at Galwa and how you see the security as a strategic opportunity also for enabling new analytics, especially in the cloud?
Sure.
And what does that also mean in terms of risk and best practices that we should be thinking about as we get these systems on the internet?
Sure. So I've been working with Tosni. So Tosni was supposed to be here, and actually Isaac is at the hospital having his first child. So I'm standing in, but they have been working with NIST on sort of an end-to-end secure platform to secure data. And so the thing that they've been working really hard on is, from a security standpoint, is just making security part of the conversation, which is hard, because usually people want to just sprinkle security on things after the fact. With smart cities and some of the work that they've been doing with NIST, what they're trying to do is really help with some of the privacy and security concerns and make sure that people who are developers can easily implement cryptography. Crypto is not something that's an easy thing in encrypting data in general. Implementation of that can be flawed. And so I think, how do you make it easy? How do you bring it design first and make it part of the conversation early is something that we're trying to do. So, if you can enable, data sharing and enable privacy and security and compliance, then that just becomes, another feature or functionality versus it being sort of in the middle of a tension, which is or contention is where security usually falls in a lot of what we're trying to do with security. Yeah.
Thank you. And Carl, I'm thinking about Intel's AI lab and the word community being involved as a collaborative artificial intelligence sort of project, right? Like Intel has a lot of compute power that is enabled by data in the cloud. And so how do you see this role of community interacting with the technology that's on Intel and data from various sources?
That's a really good question. So I would say what I like to focus on in terms of the community aspect and this data and then the compute power is making all of that accessible and easy for everyone in terms of how do you get your data, what do you need to do to it to then make it accessible, and then what learning techniques do you need to have in order to make sense of that data. And it's all kind of this empowerment ecosystem of what does it really take to understand and get meaningful and actionable information out of your data, and that's a hard process to do. And for a long time, that was kind of in these data silos of big companies and like Amazon and Google and Facebook, but at the same time, these same companies are also enabling the techniques they use to be used by everybody. And now we have open source frameworks and open source libraries that basically means that all you need is a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of time, and you can get that same amount of actionable insight that these big corporations use to make billions and billions of dollars, to apply that to like daily lives. And like they also have kind of paved the way forward in terms of what mistakes are there in terms of big data and like what kind of things do we need in place like GDPR to ensure privacy. And this is a big, I feel like government following behind that is a good thing in terms of like what mistakes have been made in corporations and like what things are we like seeing there that we don't want to replicate for everyone, and then what's the easy path forward in terms of balancing privacy and open data and learning things and making that actionable.
Yeah, I'd like to hear a little bit more from Leah specifically on balancing the opportunity for open data and the challenges of security. And I want to focus on security perhaps through getting big data into more of an integrated format, and then you start out with data that's not very personally identifiable or it's all secure, and then you can end up creating unknowns with a narrowing process that can create personally identifiable information. So what would be a strategic view to take when, especially now that if you imagine that this is all data in the cloud, and then you've got an Intel compute cluster and you're just an AI community member and you come in and grab this fire hose of data that's now public for your city, what should cities be thinking about? And don't scare us too much because we still, I think, want to build these systems.
Yeah, that's tough. So I think there's even an article on the Housing website or blog post that talks about this that happened in New York City with the taxi cab, sort of data that was being captured, and supposedly it was anonymous, and then people basically were able to see where celebrities were getting on and off of things, just by kind of piecing things together. So it is a real issue. Anonymization is hard. One of the things that we're looking at is how do you have both the data encrypted from while it's in transit all the way till it's at rest. So capturing it and making sure during that whole life cycle that it can be shared across services, and that you're taking care of key management and all these very complicated things that help. So that end-to-end security story is, I think, super important. And there are things that are out there, and platforms and things that people can use, but I think it requires, in the conversations, people often think they can just roll their own solution to this, which it gets complicated fast, basically. Yeah.
So the Civic platform is meant to be gathering up a bunch of different data sources that had previously maybe not been very accessible, and then making them not only actionable through APIs and being available on the web, but we want them to be interrelated and linked as much as possible, so that we can actually stitch things together to get the more positive interpretation, which is narrowing down on like very specific types of trends that can help us understand transportation decline or affordable housing that might create better policy. What is Civic's, what is your stance, Michael, on how we have addressed this? where we've preloaded, Civic platform with a bunch of Portland's data, but we do expect to be getting a lot more data soon. And as we talk to cities about concerns such as what Lee is addressing, what's your perspective on what we've done to set this up?
Yeah, so first thing I want to say is that when it comes to privacy, even though it is data, it's not a technology problem. That's more of a social and ethics problem. And as technologists, we need to be mindful of society and ethics. It's really important when we're dealing with data, because we could easily just get a bunch of data and say, now that we have it, let's just slap it in a database, make an API, and then accidentally people are able to track celebrities in New York. That's what happens when you don't think about it. So step one is being mindful and actually thinking about it. And what we've done to sort of counteract this is to make sure that when we do get really granular data, and that happens, such as ridership data from TriMet, we make sure that before we expose it to the public in an API, we aggregate it to the point where it's no longer person identifiable. So you'll notice that a lot of our aggregations are to the neighborhood level. That's not because we don't have data that's more granular. It's because we're mindful of what happens when you expose granular data. And when you have multiple data sets and you can overlap that, suddenly you can do that exact narrowing process. And now you know things about your neighbor that maybe you shouldn't.
Sure. There's so much to get into really on a fascinating topic. I can actually see your face and I'm getting excited here. Why don't you just maybe follow up on that? I'm not even going to ask you. I feel like you want to have something to add.
Yeah, I would say
Does aggregation help, or is it an opportunity?
I think it's good. So one thing I think data scientists understand is the amount of you can learn about individuals given a very small amount of data. And 3 data points, you'd be like, oh, I know exactly who this person is. And it can be completely randomized and that obfuscating the data is entirely important in order to at least remain some semblance of privacy. And it doesn't take a lot of information to define an individual, but through those good layers of kind of glossing over the layers and making more general observations, you can then still glean a lot of good information about groups, if not individuals. And that's kind of the important thing is you don't want to know exactly what your neighbor is doing, but you want to know what your neighborhood trends look like. And I think that's a very important facet in terms of privacy and actually gaining information, but then keeping people's personal lives. There's a lot of information the government has about my day-to-day life, and the weird thing for me is that now these big corporations to use Facebook as an example, there's a lot of information on Facebook that the government doesn't have, but then there's a lot of information that government agencies do have that Facebook doesn't. And then between these two things, you can infer a lot about the individuals and what their daily routines are. And the trick is to kind of hide as much of that as possible, but still gain a good model about what individuals do and what groups and trends happen, basically. It's a weird balancing act.
And I was just going to add one thing to what you said about it being sort of a social issue. I totally agree. And you can add things in that are consent-based from a technology standpoint that try to tease out some of those things that are more social.
Yes, this is a very fascinating aspect of the conversation surrounding ethics and the opportunities and the risk. And I do want to come back to it and thread it through our whole conversation, but there is another specific tactical thing I thought of when Michael mentioned granular data from TriMet, which we did get, but we got that data on a thumb drive that they just loaded up for us. We went into their office and we picked it up. Actually, there was more security to get into TriMet's admin office. I had to sign a piece of paper and have my photo taken on a badge. But I just walked right out with a thumb drive full of this data, and then I handed it to a group of volunteers that were then going to put it on the internet. And I think that it was felt okay because it's well, there's no sensitive information here. This is not a best practice. However, this is actually where we are, because every time the hack we have maybe 20 or 30 different data sets that we're working with. Some of them are online, some of them are getting sent through other transfer formats like email attachments. Like sometimes we're talking about PDFs are our data, and so we're doing this. Can you describe, okay, so Michael, why don't you give a fuller picture of like the variety of different ways in which we receive data, and then how the responsibility of having this partnership with like the custodians of that original source, how do you talk about that?
Yeah, so I gave an analogy last night that I'm about to give again, so if you were there last night, you're going to hear it twice. But the way that I think a lot of people imagine security in technology is that data exists in a vault, and then we picture the world as heist movies where people are trying to break into the vault and cartwheel across laser lines to steal art. But that's just not realistic, because especially with data, that art gets transferred all over the place, and if that transfer is just a simple van, then any thief who's worth their own weight is going to hijack the van, not try to break into the vault. And when we talk about data, you can think of all these vaults existing, but it doesn't matter how secure they are because there's a million vans driving around with this data also. Or sometimes that van is actually Cat with a jump drive. So if you really wanted that data, all you have to do is find Cat. And that's an attack vector that anybody who really wanted that data could use. So when we talk about transferring data, we have to think about that no matter how secure your vault is, the weakest link is where a hacker is going to go after. So when we're transferring data, and we do it over thumb drives, over email, over just like simple data upload to shared FTP servers or whatnot, if those channels aren't secure, then someone's going to find out, and then they're going to tap into that, and then that's it. It doesn't matter how secure it is on either end. And there are a lot of ends. That's the other thing that's kind of important to note is it isn't just one transfer. We've created a graph of places where data lives, and between all of those nodes are edges that could be hacked. So everything in that entire web needs to be secure.
Wait, yeah, would you like to follow up?
Yeah, I agree. And this kind of goes to the point of, the vans being the data in transfer, and then the vaults being the data at rest, and being cognizant of all those different points and having a good solution that, and also thinking about it from the design perspective, right? That's probably where you're spending a lot of time, is thinking about sort of a design first. How do we want to create this, the right architecture and infrastructure, and what are the attack vectors, and where's the data being moved, and having good solutions to address, this very complicated web. And I've talked about crypto being one of them, but there are lots of things that go into that equation.
Well, this is an on-the-fly kind of metaphor. I'm trying to think about if you've got these vans and if you've got these vaults, it's almost like Intel has a opportunity to sort of now, maybe it's all securely gotten to the place, and then Intel just wants to like let you process it all. It's like all just to, let's get it on the cloud and then let's give it all away again. There is almost like a little bit of a absurdity to how we are looking at all of the secure transfer, but then the ultimate goal, if you want open data, is now just to let everybody have it.
Right. I think that transparency is like the necessary factor in all of this. Is like, and there's also like cross-validation basically. You want everything that someone can say to be replicatable by anybody else, and like that transparent data and those transparent data processing processes need to be like available for everybody, and that's kind of the thing, and that's why I really like the whole Civic platform. It's like, you don't need to have a data warehouse, you don't need to have a data scientist, you don't need to have like the education behind it or the knowledgeable staff. Basically, this is meant to be approached by everybody, and that's how you ensure that it is fair, effectively. And like the points being made are in everybody's general instance or like benefit, and that the points being made are also correct and as verifiable as possible within like human ability. And as like an AI engineer, I have like lots of human like human ability is probably like the weakest link in terms of a lot of things. Like you're mentioning all these vans, and in computer security we have a term called social engineering, where the weakest link in any secure system is the human. And just being like, oh, sorry, I forgot my key badge. Can I drive this van today? They're like, sure, it's okay. It's Wednesday. Nobody cares. But I think there's new technologies that kind of help counteract that, like blockchain, for example, where you can verify that throughout the entire process, this van has been like, it hit these checkpoints, and through that entire process, you have had a secure cargo load. And regardless of like if it's a thumb drive or a file being mailed or digital transfer, you can verify like, yes, everyone agrees that this was secure the entire way. And that's another benefit about blockchain and transparency and decentralizing the data sources, in that it is now a public consensus in terms of this is the best way we see to do it now, and everybody kind of agrees. And that's, I think, the most important part.
If I can add a little more to that, Kat.
Yeah.
The social engineering part is like super duper important. I would just want to say that security itself, although there's a lot of security technology, security isn't technology. People were protecting company secrets long before computers existed. It's a protocol and process. And what you need to do as an organization is make sure everybody's educated on that. Because I don't want to blame TriMet on this, because this happens all the time. It could be email upload or whatever. There are probably security people in those organizations that have thought long and hard about this and what the right thing to do is. But if an employee isn't following those best practices, then you have a data breach, even though they're prepared for it. So you need to make sure everybody is educated on what to do. And the opportunity technology brings to that is, if you're using technology correctly, be it blockchain, be it end-to-end encryption, you are enabling people to accidentally do things the right way. So without thinking about it, you have securely transferred data, because that's just, it's harder to not do it than it is to do it correctly. So that's the opportunity that technology brings to that challenge.
Well, I absolutely agree with that completely, 100%. And Greg is here. Hello, Greg. And he's with Tosni, and you could probably vouch to how much education goes into this, right? Like, so education is paramount just in terms of security in general, and understanding, and then also that user-first approach. Like, how do you make it so that it's invisible? They don't even know that they're using something that's better, more secure. The consent is so easy for them to share this information across services. But it's also informative, and they're able to make these decisions. So yeah, that was a great point.
I would like to, so when Sakwu asked us to update our action cluster worksheet to include how the Civic platform was addressing security, I had to make a roundtable with Michael and with Jared, because like really we had not claimed to have fancy open source security encryption like our own, because we do a lot of custom work, and this is just an area that we were having to look to the broader discussion of what is best practice and think seriously about whether or not we were going to have our own solution to this, or if we could. There's a lot of other proprietary, like Tosni is not open source, but they do have really important, good use cases for things that our partners are going to want to have on the city side. And so it gets back to interoperability. And I think that what really helped to clarify things for me when we boiled it all down is that our number one strategy for security is recommending to our partners that they are understanding how the ownership and custodianship of this data, how they want to do it. And having, at that point, maybe you can speak a little bit more about specifically the types of encryption processes that allow you not only to, because you can very securely give data to somebody who shouldn't have it, and then once they have it, then it goes anywhere. So how we are able to do this with new technologies that can be secure throughout the life cycle of data and help us maybe rewind, not that you can always do that, but like when there is a problem, that at least we can trace this back to various sources.
Well, I think, part of it is, well, one thing I wanted to mention is, using things that work well, that are, and you guys probably did, that are already out there and that are open source. And even though TOSNI has a proprietary component to it, it's, pulling from libraries that, are open source, that are open auth and, well-known technologies that are out there. So that was just one comment I wanted to make on that that's super important in terms of there is stuff out there. I think what TOSNI tries to do is filter through all that and then make the implementation part itself really strong. But, whether it's blockchain, whether it's TOSNI solution, hashing, having a hash that, is a cryptographic hash that basically tracks that data all the way through. But it's also anonymous and, you can't, but you have that sort of fingerprint that is associated with the data all the way through the life cycle, I think is, a very good practice so that you can have that tracking mechanism that you were talking about. Anything else from you guys?
A little bit. One of the cool things about the security community is that all of these standards are not only open source, but they're discussed in the open. So oftentimes we think when we're protecting secrets, we need to withhold as much information as possible, but security is sort of actually the other way around. You can kind of think of this dialogue between researchers and the security community at large, where a researcher is like, hey everyone, I have this data, and what if I chunked it up, and then I applied this math using these secrets, and then did these things and those transformations? Would you be able to hack that? And the security community is like, oh, I see. Oh no, it checks out, I wouldn't be able to hack that, that's good. So, it's interesting how to create secure data, you first have an open dialogue with the entire world about how that security even works.
Wow. Carl, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I have. I think on that point, like, security and open source go really well hand in hand together because it's basically, everybody's basically volunteering that this is going to be the way we do it, and like we all agree that like, yes, we think this is the best way to do it, and it's going to work. And you have like white hat hackers, and they're constantly out there actually hacking stuff, and then saying, hey, this doesn't work, or finding security flaws in like computer architecture. That happens, but at the same time, it's these researchers and the open source community who bring those things to light. That way, either the communities or companies that build these tools can then, as quickly as possible, fix them, and so that nothing actually, like, as long as you have that front line of defense being the community at large, that you tend to avoid these vulnerabilities by identifying them before something bad happens. And I think that is an important asset in terms of ensuring that that security continues to exist.
Yeah. And one thing I would just add is sometimes it's, for people who are not technicians, open source they think might be less secure. So it's this really interesting dialogue and education process with them because they think since it's out there, it's open, that it's actually less secure. And so we've ended up having conversations with people at the county level for different sorts of challenges, and a lot of education is required just to let them know that it's actually tried and true, and you have this community supporting it, and white hat, kicking of the tires and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking that what are the right things to say to a city that is kind of thinking like open data, like we maybe know that we want to do this, but we are concerned about the security and what, it's just not even necessarily a technical specific concern that they have, but it's like there is the unknown, and that it is almost from a litigation standpoint, just easier to do nothing and not actively open the data because that you open yourself up to potential anything could go wrong. And so how do you start to make that less of an irrational fear? And particularly when open source is in the conversation, what's some vocabulary and just like some philosophy of how to talk with cities that are going through that type of crisis?
Who's the director?
That's for anybody who wants to take that, really.
Oh geez, okay, I'll say some words first. That's on. So I think the first thing is to validate that concern, because it's real. Security is super serious, and you can't just play it off like it's no big deal. Because when you do that, then you don't do it right, and then you get breached, and then you're on the news, and that's not what you want. So step one is not to, you need to make sure that that irrational fear becomes a rational fear. You need to know exactly why you're afraid, and then how to mitigate that fear. So, well, all you can really do is say, this is my data, this is why it needs to be secure, this is what can happen if we get breached, this is how we can get breached, and now we've broken down this larger irrational fear into reasonable attack vectors and what our threat model is, then you can take every single piece and make sure that that piece becomes secure, because there are solutions for pretty much every concern that you could possibly have, but the first step is figuring out what those concerns are.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think getting all the different stakeholders involved, as we've talked about, it is a tech problem, but it's also a compliance problem. And, I think, a lot of times we've had to work with people who are privacy experts from a legal standpoint and having their input and being able to, speak in the language that's not just technology first is super important.
So security and convenience are kind of opposites in that, like, the most secure thing you can have is a piece of paper with writing on it locked in a file cabinet somewhere in a basement. But that you're not going to get any good information out of that. You can't correlate that information to the piece of paper next to it in that file cabinet in your basement. And I think
Unless you know the one guy who's read both pieces of
right.
paper, and then you just find him and ask him.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's a really good thing is, like, information used to be very personally located. Like, there was one person who knew exactly what those two pieces of paper said because he wrote them and then filed them. And in order to actually share that information, you have to also, like, make it more accessible and, like, show, and, like, at the same time still keep it private. But I think people are kind of coming into mind that with the internet and, like, new technologies that are super pervasive, we're hitting the Patton Oswalt calling the term etowaf. So everything that ever was forever and always. Basically, at some point, you will be able to find out information about anything you want, and it will always be there. So, and we're very nearly close to that point. And while at one side it is very, like, scary and daunting, at the same time it's very informative in that you're kind of opening up all this information to everybody, and it's no longer siloed into file cabinets in your basement or the person who filed it. It's now accessible to everybody, and people can kind of check each other and, like, verify that this is the right way to do it. So, yeah.
I have a good question to ask you guys. So it seems like as you have, let's just call you all, like, deep experts in this topic, and when you think about etowaf, in this state that we're approaching, are you excited, actually? I mean, I kind of get the sense that we are almost comfortable in the world where this may be the case, or maybe not. So I'm interested to hear just your sort of personal feelings in relationship to this time and place that we're in, coming from people who think deeply about security, and you know all those risks. They're not, irrational, they're very rational look, but still, I will go first, and I'll say that, I'm not a security expert, but I definitely am invested in getting open data, and I understand that, like, my relationship personally to, like, the city government knowing things about me, or other different kinds of companies knowing things in my participation, I'm personally comfortable with it, because I think that the benefit just outweighs my own sense of like, I want to keep, no one needs to know anything about me. I want to, I'm leaning into it, and I'm like amped for more data getting on the web. How do you feel about that?
I can start if you want.
Yeah, I think I made the decision a few years ago that I was completely fine with Google knowing more about me than even myself. And like the algorithm, like when you sit down and you realize that an algorithm now knows more about you than your mother, and you're like, oh, well, okay. And I think part of it is that's a very specific algorithm, and it's like targeting me for advertising. And yeah, I did want to learn about that and buy it, but at the same time, if you can somehow replicate that across your entire life, and now like also have like civic and governmental agencies being like using this same kind of methodologies in terms of like analyzing and using your behavior patterns, and then also improving on your life in terms of like, all these people actually had a bad day, how can we make their day better? And it's not through like selling a product or anything else, it's gonna be through policy change, or like maybe we need a new fire department here, or maybe we need like police to be more respectful, and like, I think leaning into it kind of gives you that advantage, and being fine with it and accepting that like everybody now knows everything about everybody is kind of a different way, and you can be afraid of it and become a Luddite, and I've thought about that a lot of times, and I probably at some point in the next 10 or 15 years will just kind of go off the grid and become a hermit and be like really, you know, lean into that for a while. But for now, I think that being open with everybody and like trying to embody that is the best way forward, because if we're all kind of open about it and we're all just like, we're just gonna try to analyze our behaviors for everybody's good and like go from there and hope, it's kind of a position of hope, effectively. It's like, this could be used for bad things, but we're gonna be hopeful that it's gonna be used for good things, and because we're all in it together, that's hopefully the way it will go.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of where I feel that way, right? But I also feel like giving other people the opportunity to have the power themselves to consent from a privacy perspective, even, privacy and security, they're two sides of a coin. So there's the whole security thing where, yeah, people could do bad things, right? And I think being able to have some sort of balance is going to be really interesting to see if we can find that on both sides of the coin, such that it is open and we get that. But I do feel, very much like, yeah, Google knows everything, Facebook knows everything. Our definition of privacy, I feel like, is changing and will continue to change. And with people who are different younger generations than me, feel much different about like privacy doesn't, so it's going to be interesting to see the gradations and the differences, but being able to take care of that on an individual level and also be able to have the benefits of the openness, that's what I hope we can get to.